Here's what you're missing over at patreon.com/addressing Gettysburg.
You're listening to Addressing Gettysburg.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to this episode of Addressing Gettysburg. And today we're going to talk about something that, if you're a student of the battle, you've certainly heard of the Bureau of Military Information, or the BMI. And we have finally found ourselves an expert who can speak expertly on the subject. He is, he's from the Defense Intelligence Agency. He's the chief historian. He's also an adjunct professor of intelligence at Johns Hopkins. And his name is Greg Elder. Hello, Greg. How are you?
Fantastic. And you?
Good. I'm sorry that you had a soda explode on your lap right before we started here. But, that's what happens, I guess, when you're very excited and nervous about doing such a worldwide show. As this one, that you probably shake your soda unwittingly and it explodes all over your lap when you open it.
I was just thinking about McClellan and intelligence, and I just start jittering whenever that happens. The soda must have exploded because of that.
So the BMI, it comes in 1863. It's not part of the Union War effort. Prior to that, it's a new thing Joseph Hooker establishes. But what did the Union Army use before that? Just cavalry, or did they have some kind of something?
So the Union tried to develop an intelligence capability in 1862 with McClellan, and he's principally going to use what we call human intelligence, which is the use of collection by human beings, right, in every way possible. So it's pocket litter, it's interrogations of prisoners, spies. But the problem with McClellan is a couple things. One, he doesn't really try aggressively to collect information. So he has a couple of spies that operate near Richmond. A couple of them are captured and killed. They're executed. He doesn't use his cavalry effectively. Essentially, McClellan's going to use his cavalry to protect his logistics supply train, and also as a Praetorian Guard, right? He likes to ride around and be seen with lots of other horses and big flags and things like that. And he's not going to aggressively use cavalry as the Confederates do with Jeb Stuart to go out and aggressively obtain information. He has a spy chief, Alan Pinkerton, who was an investigator before the war, who he hires to be his intelligence officer. And, there's a lot of people who really attack Pinkerton as the reason that the intelligence was so bad in 1862. You have Pinkerton, who inflates these numbers of the adversary of the Confederate forces and gives it to McClellan, and so a lot of people want to just wash their hands and say it's Pinkerton. It's interesting that Pinkerton's first intelligence assessment to McClellan asks him how many Confederates are there in the state of Virginia. So not just in Joseph Johnston's army at the time, but in the entire state. And he gives an estimate of 116,000 soldiers. Now, we know today that the actual number was 117,000 soldiers.
Okay.
So it was a very, very accurate, the type of intelligence, assessment that we look today and be like, that's great, that's spot on, right? He was able to accurately portray the rough number of regiments that the Confederates had by looking at the size of the Union regiments and illnesses and things like that. He was able to develop kind of an estimate of what a Confederate regiment would look like. And then just drawing out the numbers, like how many regiments do they have? How many people do they have per regiment? How large are their cavalry forces? He was able to develop a fairly accurate assessment. So he goes to McClellan. Hey, boss, here's your assessment, right? So we're looking at about 116,000 soldiers. Shouldn't be too much of a problem. We have over 100,000 soldiers ourselves just in our army. We're good to go. And McClellan chides him. There's no way the Confederates have 116,000 soldiers. Johnston himself probably has 200,000 soldiers. So how can the entire Confederate forces in the state of Virginia be 116,000 people? And it's after that incident, that every single estimate that Pinkerton gives McClellan is grossly inflated. And then what we have is McClellan, and we have numerous instances of this. So the people who say, well, maybe McClellan just misunderstood or whatever. We have dozens of instances where we have Pinkerton's numbers, and then we have telegraphs going to Washington where McClellan is giving his view of what's happening to Lincoln and the administration, and the number that he gets from Pinkerton one day is exponentially increased the next day and then telegraphed to Washington, D.C. So, for instance, in the when they're at the Occoquan River in 1861 to 1862, two of the staff officers for McClellan do their own independent assessments of Johnston's army. They say it's about 60,000 men. Two newspapers, actually they say it's about 70 to 80,000 men. Two newspapers do assessments, and they say it's about 60,000 men. So you have 60,000 men, 80,000 men, and then Pinkerton gives McClellan a number that's over 100,000 men. Then McClellan gives D.C. a number of like between 150 and 200,000 people.
Uh-huh.
Well, yeah, so if you believe that, if you're McClellan and you actually look in the mirror and say, I'm facing an enemy of 150 to 200,000 men, how aggressive, again, are you going to be in carrying the war to destroy Johnston's army? And it was all hokey. It was all wrong. So, the use of balloons, whatever intelligence that he's getting in 1862, it's almost irrelevant because aside from being able to identify where the Confederate forces are, every number that he gets is absolutely wrong. When they land on the peninsula for the Peninsula Campaign in 1862, he has 87,000 men roughly that comes on shore, and there's only 10 to 15,000 Confederates opposing him. And there's intelligence that they come forward and they tell McClellan, hey, we only have like Magruder in front of us with a small force, maybe 15,000 men. He wires up to Washington, and before long is saying, I have 150 to 200,000 men in front of me. Well, Washington's wiring back saying, well, wait, but Johnston is still up near the Occoquan River. So if Johnston's army, which has the host of all the Confederate forces, is near the Occoquan River, how can the bulk of forces now be down on the peninsula, slowing down and stopping your campaign? So, the biggest problem in 1862 is the tools that we're going to see the BMI use in 1863. All those tools are there. It's the fact that there was not a customer who wanted accurate, usable intelligence to be able to operate from. And there's all of the biases that we can talk about with McClellan. I'm sure you guys have done other shows where people talk about it. He was terrified of failure. After the Battle of Seven Pines, he got to see a large part of his force. He had to see 7,000 Union casualties. And he loves his troops so much that he doesn't want to lose more soldiers. So there's a bias there. He just absolutely is terrified of losing. And so he doesn't fight to win. He fights not to lose. And obviously, from the Union perspective, where your entire goal is to defeat the Confederacy to, bring the Southern states back into the U.S. fold, you can't fight not to lose. You have to fight to win. You have to assume some risk. You have to go out and actually fight. And he doesn't do that. My favorite instance is during the Antietam campaign when Lee crosses the Potomac River and McClellan begins his march to fight Lee. He's assessing that Lee has 120,000 men. Now, we know it's 40 to 50,000.
Right.
So we're already talking more than double. Then there's the Battle of South Mountain. And McClellan wires back, greatest victory in human history, a huge victory. We won. We destroyed like a large part of the Confederate forces. He has the perfect intelligence in his hand from Lee's lost orders. He squanders it. He fights the Battle of South Mountain, inflicts a few thousand casualties on the Confederates. And he wires Washington that he inflicted 20,000 casualties on the Confederates.
So is he purposefully, is he lying? Or is he just getting bad information?
Well, he's getting bad information because he's essentially from the beginning asked for bad information.
Okay.
What Edwin Fischel, and Edwin Fischel is like the master craftsman of history for the intelligence in the Civil War. He found the BMI records in 1959 and spent almost 40 years writing The Secret War for the Union and didn't tell anybody. Thank God the book came out, because if he'd have been hit by a car, we wouldn't know a lot of the stuff that we have today. And several authors and myself have relied on his research to really kick things up to understand better. Fischel looks at McClellan and says, Antietam's the perfect example of explaining McClellan, because McClellan wanted to be the Napoleon. He wanted to be successful. He wanted to be a hero, but he didn't want to risk losing. Well, he assesses after South Mountain that Lee has 100,000 men. Lee, of course, again, has 45,000 or something like that. Mm-hmm. When he fights Lee, Lee loses Lee loses over 10,000 men. He loses a quarter of his army. In reality, what we know today, Lee lost a quarter of his army. And then Lee stays the day after the Battle of Antietam and retreats. And Lincoln wires McClellan, you have to follow up your victory, right? You have to go and you have to destroy Lee. And McClellan's response is, I can't. Lee has 140,000 troops. Now, we've gone from 120 the couple days before South Mountain to 100 because he lost 20,000. Lee supposedly lost 20,000 men at South Mountain. Then he supposedly, Lee loses a huge part of his forces at the Battle of Antietam, which should take, even using McClellan's logic, should take it from 100,000 to something substantially less than 100,000. And he's wiring Washington that Lee has 140,000 men. Yeah. So Lee has miraculously
gained men since the battle.
60,000 men.
Yeah. Wouldn't that be nice?
So Fischel's thing is that McClellan almost certainly believed that he was always outnumbered. And he just wanted the confirmation of numbers to be able to substantiate it because he was so terrified of losing. He was so concerned about his reputation and the destruction of his army that he just wasn't willing to buy into the fact that he outnumbered the Confederates. And of course, at Antietam, he destroys the center of Lee's line at the Sunken Road. He's got an entire corps sitting there waiting, right, to attack, and he doesn't attack. So that to Fischel is kind of the Lee or McClellan actually is buying into the fact that he's always outnumbered. And what that does is I have a really big presentation on McClellan and intelligence in the Civil War, and there's 7 instances that I outline where his misinterpretation of numbers, or whatever you want to call it, 7 instances where there were dramatic opportunities lost in 1862 to have, if not won the war, at least significantly pushed the Union closer to victory. So when McClellan is finally fired, Burnside doesn't do anything either. In fact, when McClellan leaves, Pinkerton leaves with him. Burnside takes over the army. He does literally nothing. Daniel Butterfield, when Hooker becomes the commander, he's the chief of staff essentially for Hooker, and Butterfield is mystified at the fact that when they take over the offices of Burnside, there's not a single piece of paper in the entire headquarters that indicates anything about Lee's order of battle, his strength, his capability, his intentions, where he's getting his logistics from. There's literally nothing to enable an army commander to effectively look at the adversary and say, what are my best opportunities to be able to successfully achieve a victory?
That sounds insane.
Yeah, and
you should think that while Burnside was commander, the Battle of Fredericksburg happened. He had nothing to indicate that he was seeking intelligence on Lee's army.
No, he basically took the information that McClellan handed over. He had a couple of other short assessments done by staff. They all indicated that he was outnumbered, and which was all the more baffling that he's going to take his army across the river and do 13 frontal assaults against an enemy on high ground behind a stone wall.
Piecemeal assaults. It's not even like 13 in 13 different locations. It's one location, basically.
So that's why, with Hooker, there's lots of reasons to be frustrated with Hooker. He is not obviously the great army commander that you would hope to have. Obviously, he proved himself to be a very effective division and corps commander, but he never had kind of the skill set that was needed to be able to effectively take command of an entire army, particularly against Lee, because he's terrified of Lee. Right. I think that we can all kind of agree that at least at some point McClellan is not as eager and aggressive against Lee as he might have been against another commander. But no matter what we say about Hooker, when he takes over the army, he had seen at Antietam opportunities. Even though he was wounded, he heard soldiers. He had heard people coming in and telling him, there's opportunities here. Hey, we can still win this battle. He comes in and he's mystified, obviously, at the organization of the army, so he reorganizes it. He doesn't like the artillery, the way that it's set up, so he reorganizes that. The morale of the men is low, so he creates the patches and things like that, starts sending men home. But I think the most significant probably impact that Hooker had in the war was the establishment of the intelligence organization that from there on out, then at least provided effective information about Lee's order of battle, its size, where it's going to be moving, how it's operating, and really including, for the first time in history, all of the different...
Listen to the rest of this interview and dozens like it. Support the show and get early access to special episodes, early and discounted ticket sales, and more. The second lieutenant level and above gets access to all monthly Patreon episodes. So please go to patreon.com/addressinggettysburg, choose a tier, and join. And I thank you in advance.